Show today. On today's episode, I am pleased to welcome returned Peace Corps volunteer from Ukraine and current civil affairs soldier with the Army Reserve, Corey Retell. Corey, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jonah. Thanks. What's the idea here? What's the concept? I'm interested in learning what's going on.
Well, so on this episode, you obviously have a bunch of interesting things to talk about. I really want to talk about your time in the Peace Corps, what it was like living in Ukraine. Obviously, there's a lot going on over there now. And then what you're doing in the reserves right now, that seems pretty interesting. So I
And
guess
and
this,
I'm your first person.
yeah, I got to
Am I
start
am I
somewhere, and
really
you
am
have
I
a lot
really
to
the only
talk about.
am I really the only person you know in the army? Is that what that means?
Well, no, but I got to start somewhere, and you have some interesting things to talk
Cool.
about.
Thanks. All
So,
right. Cool.
so the Peace Corps.
Yeah.
How did you get involved in that, and how did you get to Ukraine? Like, were there other options? Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I think I had first gotten interested in it in high school. Um, you know, we went to the same high school in Peace Corps. How long did you go to Canisius? 2 years, right?
2 years, yep.
Yeah, okay. Um, but even Joe's and maybe Ridley, I don't know, and other schools sort of like that, service trips are kind of a common thing, and so
Right.
it kind of fit into the theme of like high school, and so I became aware of it in high school. And yeah, so come the end of college, trying to figure out what to do next, and considered it. Ended up going to law school. Ended up not finishing my first semester there for a variety of reasons, and then returned to looking to go into the Peace Corps because the application lead times are kind of long. So like I left law school in November 2017, and like they were already taking applications for like August and the end of summer the next year. So
Gotcha.
anyway, so that worked out well, sort of with my calendar of things I thought, and looked to apply then. And I think the process has changed since. I think it also changed before me, but when I applied, it was you get to rank your preferences of where you want to go, and then they uh, basically give you one option. They'll revert. First of all, you're accepted or not, and then if you're accepted, they'll revert to you with where they want to send you, and
Hmm.
you get like one chance to be like, can we can we go again? Can we try a different place? And they could end up coming back with the same place, or they could end up coming with a different place. And Peace Corps at the time, I think, was in over 60 countries, so
Okay.
quite a number of
So,
countries.
so let
And
me
then they
ask
came
you.
back with Mongolia.
Gotcha. So let me ask you before you continue on with the rest of that.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah.
when you originally applied, what were your five locations you were really looking to go to? Like, was Ukraine at the top of the list?
I think it was three, and I
Okay.
think Ukraine was. Yes, I know Ukraine was at the top of the list, and I think the other two were also European, like Montenegro and Albania, something like
Okay.
that. It might have been North Macedonia. At the time, it was just Macedonia. Yeah, it was like some combination of that, but Ukraine was definitely the top.
Okay. Nice. And so, you fill out the application, you get accepted, you find out you're going to Ukraine. What was like the process between the time you got accepted and then when you got there? Was there what kind of training do you have to go to? How did they prep you for being ready to like live in Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, first, like I mentioned, they came back as to try to send. They wanted me to go to Mongolia, and I wasn't so gung ho on that.
Okay.
Mostly because what I know of Peace Corps Mongolia is like you're out there in this. I mean, Mongolia generally, like there's one city, and it's the least densely populated country in the world. So anyway, so I like went back to them and said like, no thanks,
Hmm.
can we try again? And they came back with Ukraine. So Ukraine. Yeah. So that was, I guess, I applied November, probably found out in December, I would guess. And I didn't leave until August. There's a lengthy period where you don't really, as far as I remember, maybe I'm missing stuff, and this was 2017 to 18, so it was a little while ago. Not really anything, but to leave, all the volunteers come, actually, we came here to DC. Some go to like New York and other major airport locations before you fly out together. And we had like a 2 day there's a term for it, I can't remember, pre-departure conference here in DC. And then we all went out together, our group, they call them groups like class.
Hmm.
And then you have 3 months basically of it's called PST, pre-service training in country. And so we landed in Kiev, and pretty much like the first kind of, not really the first, but like uh, Yeah. The first city to the west of Kiev was where our training town was. So they set you up all volunteers in the same training town for those 3 months. You all basically learn how to be a teacher and learn how to be, because we were all English teacher, teaching English as a foreign language was our volunteer, was our service, and you learn language. Those are like the two components, because the vast majority of us, you don't have to be a teacher to be a Peace Corps teacher, and so the vast majority of us had never been teachers. So 3 months of a crash course on how to be a teacher and the language, and you live with a host family. And yeah, still in touch with my host family today. Got very lucky there. Love them to death, and visited several times since. But
So when I asked that, I know, just knowing you, I know you had two host families. How did it go with your first one to your second one? And then, like, can you stay with the host family if they want you for the continuation of your service?
question, yeah.
Or what prompted you to want to get your own place? And did they subsidize that for you, or how did that kind of work?
Good question. Lots of good questions. If I miss any, ask me again. Yeah, so after you're in that training town, you all get sent to your site, they call it. So it's a different town. Now, some people, I think, very few, stayed in that training town. And basically the vast majority of us knew we were leaving that training town at the end of 3 months, so leaving that host family, of course. And that was honestly really difficult, maybe the most difficult moment of my service, because up until that point, obviously huge culture shock, and no more than I really expected, but just the average amount of culture shock for a place as different.
Right.
And that family to me was Ukraine, right? Like that apartment, that family, all that. So it was a difficult transition period, I would say. But my second host family was amazing, in my permanent site town, and could not have done it without them either. And so you have to stay with that second host family for 3 months. You can extend all the way up to the duration of the time you're there, if they agree, of course, also.
Mm-hmm.
And I chose to say 6 in the end, before I found my own place and moved out for then a year. So it's 27 months that you're there the whole time, but of course we got sent home March of 2020, obviously, and ended up staying in my own place only around a year, and the full length, 3 months, and then the year is obviously like 21 months or 20, something like that.
Right. So I guess then that kind of leads me. So when you got your own place, like kind of what was that like? I mean, like I've worked in the real estate business and property management. Like there's a long application process. Like were they asking you to
Yeah.
like did the U.S. did the government, did the Peace Corps help you guys find a place? Did they like have it organized? Like how did that go?
That's really good question. Really interesting, because it's bringing back some memories that I haven't thought about, like parts of the whole looking for apartments process, which wasn't super smooth. That's part of the reason I stayed so long. I mean, I wanted to stay with my family longer than 3 months. I didn't feel like I had to get out right at the 3 months. I was perfectly happy there, but I did end up wanting my own place. It was actually, I think, the very first place I'd ever lived without a roommate. So I was really anxious, and obviously host families and such. So I was really anxious to kind of like get my own place, literally for the first time ever in my life. And so, yeah, there's not like background checks. There's not like signing leases. I don't think I signed
Is
anything. I
there
did.
like what do you say, like proof of funds? Like did you have to show you could pay the rent? Like how?
No, so that's a good question. No, so Pete, the way it worked then anyway, and the currency is worth a lot less now, like almost twice as less. So the numbers would be different, but at the time it was like 7,000, 8,000 in their currency, which is like $300 to $350 depending on the exchange rate. That's your stipend for the month. That's all you make. And that goes obviously a lot longer way than it does here. But it's still tight. And so I remember my rent being, I think, somewhere between 2 and 3,000. So, getting
A,
close to like
a
40,
month?
40, 2 to 3,000 of their currency. So $100 of the
Okay.
350.
Gotcha.
So not terrible percentages, but like a decent chunk. And you're not saving any of the rest or anything. So it's literally a stipend just to make sure that you get through the month to the next month. And that's your Peace Corps salary. Uh,
Gotcha.
yeah. And proof of funds or anything, no. But so obviously, I had some language skills, but I wasn't super fluent or anything. So what happens is you typically have like one counterpart, who is like your main sponsor, your main helper, who's a teacher at the school where you teach, and she or he, but in Ukraine almost always would be a she, like helps you around town, like, especially obviously after I left my host family, again, got language skills, but like the particulars of a rental agreement, like not in my language skills, at least at that point, certainly. So like any time I went to visit an apartment, it was coordinating with her to find time that she was free to go. We were going together. I think it was like maybe my third or fourth apartment that I looked at, but like the first three were like, yeah, no, I don't want to live here. This one was like acceptable. And yeah, and like 1 month safety deposit, security deposit, I think, and paying cash. I paid in cash every month. The landlord literally came over and just sat down with me and counted the money and wrote in a notebook. Like everybody had a page in his notebook, like, their or whatever. Yeah, it's funny looking back on it. I haven't thought about that, honestly.
That's kind of crazy. All right, well, that's awesome. And so then you got your own place, but I want to go back a little bit. Like when you first got to Ukraine, you kind of talked about the culture shock. Tell me about, what did you learn about the country and like the people and the culture? Like what were the biggest things that stood out?
Everything centers around food or drink. There's no gathering, one funny thing, which I'm sure I've mentioned to you at some point, is like they don't really drink water. Like not long into me being there, I'm like, how are you all still standing? Like you don't really drink water. The only water they get is like through coffee or tea. And also like if it's caffeinated, then it's like a dehydrant. So like how are you alive? Like I don't understand. And it was pretty early on in like my dinners with my host family. Pretty much every night we were having dinner as a host family, the first host family in my training town, first days, weeks, and months. We were having like dinner together, and it was host mom, dad, and one host brother. They had one son, and I remember like maybe second, third meal, something like that, thinking like, are we gonna drink something? They don't drink when they eat; they drink like before and after.
Okay.
It's just a funny little thing, but just an example of like culture shock where I would ask like, "Can I have water?" And they're like, "Oh, sure, yeah, I guess." Like that's what you want. Where was I going with that?
Well, I want to go off. You said everything centers around food and drink. I remember a good point you said to me, and you kind of, maybe try to relate it to history a little bit. And you're like, they always finish everything they have to eat. And it was like you kind of made a reference to like when, Ukrainian people maybe used to be starved or things like that. So it's like they, for some reason, might think that happened again. So they like eat what's there to get it down.
Yeah, I don't know about like always finish like what they cook because they always cook too much. But they certainly kind of like finish what's on their plate for sure.
Okay. And
But
do you still stand by that kind of?
yeah, oh yeah, they like, and you can ask my brother this, and I'm sure you've talked about it with him when he came to visit me. Their goal is to like stuff you. Like, my host mom would just say to me in Ukrainian and Russian, just like eat, 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 like come on, eat, eat, and it's like I'm genuinely full, like I'm gonna burst, and so it's definitely a bit of like a historical psychological thing where. And I know we've talked about this before. There was a famine, like a forced famine by Stalin. I think 1932 to 33. There's even a monument to it here in D.C., just down the street from the Capitol, which I didn't know until I moved here. It's called Holodomor, and it's just kind of like always in their brain for sure. I mean, subconsciously, they're not thinking about that consciously. I don't think, but they definitely. I don't know if they would eat. I don't know if they eat more overall. They're certainly not as like overweight as Americans are generally.
Could have to do with what's in the food, maybe too.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. It's like all home cooked.
Like, what were some of the big dishes? Like, what are the big things you'd eat like on a regular basis?
Yeah, and they get it all from like the bazaar, right? Like it's home cooked, home like grown from a farm in their province. Yes, totally. Yeah, lots of cabbage, not just like cabbage, but cabbage in lots of dishes. So there's actually something I grew up with my Polish grandma they call it holtzy, and in Polish it's called like głąbki or something like that. Cabbage rolls, basically. That was one that I liked. Borscht, of course, everybody knows borscht.
Well,
Um,
no. Well, what if people don't? What is it? What's borscht?
it's like it's a beet soup, and I hate
That's
beets, but it's actually pretty good. It's okay. It's all right. Depends on actually the fixings. Like one thing they love to do generally is just throw sour cream on everything,
okay.
and they do that with borscht. And and I had to be like, yeah, no, no sour cream, thanks. So there's definitely, I always like to say they over, in my opinion. First of all, the dishes are either a big home run or a big swing and a miss. There's a gross dish called hollandaise, which is it's like meat jelly, gelatin, basically. It's the texture, just the texture itself is not doable for me.
Yeah.
The fish they eat is it's not very good fish. It's like they're picking the bones out of their teeth, sort of thing. But the borscht is great. Holbcy is great. Vareniki, which is like pierogi, if you've ever had Polish pierogi, delicious. Pelmeni, which is like a smaller pierogi, basically the same thing. Deroni, which is like potato pancakes. Lots of potatoes, potatoes all over the place. Yeah, really, really good dishes. And like pretty early on, my host mom got to know what dishes I liked and didn't. And, you know, she, like all Ukrainians, but especially my host mom, just like lived to cook for people generally, but me specifically. So,
Okay. Well, that's pretty cool. So, now we kind of talked about the food and living situation, your host family a little bit. I want to ask you about like your actual service. Like you mentioned, you were an English teacher. How was that like? How was it working with the students over there? And then like just kind of overall, like looking back on your experience in the Peace Corps, would you like recommend it? Would you have done it again?
yes, absolutely. The only difficult part of it is the financial part. Coming straight out of college and then law school, it actually worked out really well with like student loans I took out for law school because you don't have to pay them when you're in Peace Corps. And then COVID happened and there was that pause. And so like I've never paid a penny. And then I joined the Army, so I've never paid a penny on my student loans, which is very helpful. But like $300, $350 a month, especially when you're in Europe and they have like cheap flights, really cheap flights to the rest of Europe, and like you want to go on,
Hmm.
you know, your free time and on your weekends, you can kind of tend to rack up the credit card a little bit, which is
Well, to
pretty sweet.
talk about that, it's crazy because I have a couple friends that went to like medical school in Ireland, and like flying around Europe there is like would be like us like in Buffalo going to New York for a weekend. Like it would just like you'd
Not
be in
even.
Ireland and be going to Germany just for the week to Berlin for the weekend or something, and I'd be like, wait, what? I didn't realize how convenient, how close it was to
Absolutely.
travel to different spots.
It's you know, like you can find cheap flights here for sure, but you definitely lower the bar. Like I was flying, you know, round trip to London for like $40 and
Hmm.
back, and
Yeah,
then
that's
staying with a friend that lives there, so not paying for accommodations. But then, you know, you go out to eat, and I was like, oh my God, I'm back in like fast food land and stuff, and all these American and Western brands. I'm gonna go to
yeah,
Shake Shack. I'm gonna go to Chipotle. And like spending $100 in food in 2 days, like you know.
yeah.
But yeah, that's really the only aspect of it that I would caution people on. Maybe like if they have some savings, that's great. That helps. Because you're not allowed to have like another stream of income. I don't know how closely they check that, but like technically your Peace Corps stipend is supposed to be your only stream of income. You can have savings, you can use your savings, but yeah. Um, so that's the only aspect I would caution someone. But other than that, like especially right out of college, that's when most people do it, or pretty young, you know, 20s.
Hmm.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly recommend it. And the job itself, so I taught in like a regular public school. From it goes from kindergarten to what we would consider end of high school. They only go to 11th grade though, but they start a year late, so it's like first grade to 12th grade basically. And yeah, I had students in uh, eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th. So like our ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th. And I'm very glad and grateful that they gave me kids that age because I feel like I gelled with them pretty well.
Hmm.
But I don't think I could have done any younger. Like I occasionally subbed, obviously, like here for other teachers. yeah, it did not go well. I did not, especially obviously their language ability is
Right.
so um,
Well,
if
it's not always easy to work with younger kids, and then given the fact that like you don't speak the same language as them, like there might be like some cultural barriers, things like that. So like I can understand why like working with older kids would be like a better experience.
there's also an element of you're just kind of the cool teacher to begin with. You're the
Yeah.
American. You're the foreigner. You're the American. You're young. Most of their teachers are not nearly as young as,
Yeah.
let's see, when I got there, I was 23, I think. So by default, like that's a good thing, I think.
Hmm.
You can kind of capture their attention and stuff, but at the same time, they don't really take you as seriously. And I think that is not as big of a factor when you're talking about high schoolers, but when you're talking about like, at least in my experience, lower than that, the lack of taking you seriously is just like you don't have authority. Basically, it's just kind of a madhouse.
Yeah.
Uh, Whereas like I got to be kind of the cool teacher and maintain authority for the older kids, I think.
Gotcha. All right. Well, that's awesome. And
Yeah.
you know, like now that you're done, and you kind of touched on it. You know, your time there was cut a little short with COVID. They send you home in 2020. Was it
Yeah,
March
6 months early.
2020? Yeah,
6 months early, March of 2020. Yep.
March 2020. And then you've been home since. Well, in the States since and working. And
Yeah.
so I kind of want to talk to you now about circling back to your experience in Ukraine. So obviously there's a war going on in Ukraine. What were your feelings like? What was going through your head when Russia initially invaded Ukraine? And what were your overall thoughts?
Yeah, I'm gonna struggle for like coherent thoughts because it was just surreal. It was just I mean I can give a little bit of sort of the timeline of things because that's really how I, looking back on it, ever since it's happened and is continuing to happen, have kind of replayed it in my head whenever I've replayed it, which is honestly, I, generally try to ignore it. But so if you recall, beginning of 2021, I think in like March or something, there was like some troop movements going on close to the border.
Yep.
And they pulled back pretty quickly. And it was kind of seen as like a feint, kind of just a little scare for Biden coming in or whatever, right? And then he met with Putin in Geneva, I think, in July, June, something like that. And I believe that was like a topic of conversation because I think they were starting to get some intel, right, at that point. And then it was like October that they were really getting signs that this was building up and happening. This is all behind the scenes, right? This is not public yet.
Right.
But
Like you don't actually know.
no, so had been no, of course not.
So no, but
Had
but
been,
what I mean by that
been
is
approaching the Ukrainians, had been approaching the Europeans and stuff, and saying like
right.
this might be happening. But then it didn't break the news. The news didn't break to the public. I think it was like December 3rd. It was like the first week of December.
Okay.
So most people obviously think of like February when it happened, but really I'm thinking like back in my, this is the whole reason I kind of went through the timeline, is just like this really started for me like December of 2021.
Okay.
Thinking about it, preparing for it. And I think you know this, I didn't think it was going to happen. I personally, for a while up in the lead up to it, I think I ascribed to, I mean, I'm no expert or anything, but just given that and this is why you're talking to me, obviously, given that I'm more connected to it than 99% of people here in the US,
Exactly. Yeah.
I have a little bit of a different perspective and certainly connections to people still there and whatever. But so I guess just kind of being from it, and we should understand, of course, the war was happening when I was there, right? There was
So
still,
that's what I want to say. Like when you
yeah.
were living there, were there conflicts? Was there talk of like a possible, like this being a possibility of an invasion by Russia? Were there conflicts internally? I want to like tell a quick story before you answer that because I remember back I was playing junior hockey in New York and we had two kids from Ukraine on my team. And now I can't tell you what was going on. I don't exactly know, but like I remember one time, the one kid used to talk on the phone all the time to family at home. One day he storms out of the locker room and he's like, I'm like, oh, like you all right? And he goes, yeah, there's civil war going on at home. And I'm like, well, shouldn't is everyone all right? Like, what's going on? And then all the other kid, they were friends, but one of them was like pro-Russia and one of them was pro-Ukrainian. So, kind of like, what was your experience? Did you see any of that when you were there? And again, like, what's the talk? Were there internal conflicts? What was going on with that?
Sure, yeah. I don't know whether that kid was the kid that was more
He was the more pro-Ukrainian kid.
oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't really classify it as civil war. It was so this was 2014. So this was long before I knew anything about Ukraine, right? Like, and again, looking back on it, I vividly remember. I didn't think about it at the time. Obviously, didn't know it was to come in the future. But I vividly remember like going home for like spring break or something from freshman year of college. That was 2013, 14 was my freshman year of college. This was February. And the Sochi Olympics were happening, or they had just finished or something.
Yeah.
And also, right around then is when the Malaysia Airlines plane went missing. And I remember we had a TV in our dorm with my two roommates, and I remember breathless coverage about that, right? And like they were also, oh, by the way, Russia invaded Ukraine. And so
Well, so
that,
in 2014, how did that get resolved? Or was that the same issue that was going on when you had gotten there? Like, how does that differ from
yes,
what
it was
is
essentially the
today?
same. There were some ceasefires that were violated, but and there was a peace talk framework. I don't remember whether it was like the second or third iteration by the time I got there or whatever, but it was like Germany, France, Ukraine, Russia were sitting down at these peace talks back in like 2014 to when I was there, basically, which would have been 18, 19, 20. And yeah, so it was not really resolved. Obviously, it was just kind of frozen. But at times it wasn't frozen. Russia invaded Crimea in 20. That was the first thing, and then
In
or was it?
2014,
Yeah, I don't even
right?
know
So,
actually. I don't even know actually whether there were like there were uprisings and separatist movements very much fomented and funded and armed by Russia themselves in the very east of the country in 2014, and also Russia invaded Crimea. They denied responsibility in both places, but then they annexed Crimea like officially. So it was like, yeah, we did do that, but they're still denying responsibility in the east, even though their fingerprints were all over it. And the exact order of those events, I honestly can't remember actually, but both 2014, right around the same time.
mhm.
I'm pretty sure the Crimea part came first, and then like the separatist Russian uprisings happened like throughout the summer. I'm pretty sure, if I remember. And then fighting, literally demarcation lines, an occupation. They claimed independence, these two republics, and then Crimea was annexed sometime in 2014, and it relatively frozen, but really not frozen. Like fighting, no movement basically, but fighting often, especially in those first couple years or so. And then I arrived in 2018. We were not allowed anywhere near. Like we had like a buffer zone that we weren't allowed to go to.
Okay.
That was near those lines of fighting, the front line, and it was just basically kind of there, right? Like kind of in the east.
So this
We didn't really
conflict
go
while
there.
you were there was not in, it wasn't like Ukrainians against Ukrainians. Like it wasn't a civil war, or was it?
I mean,
Or
they
like,
were they were they were Ukrainians,
but they were like
but they
it
were
was like a
fighting with
pro-Russian versus
they were fighting with like
pro-Ukrainian.
Russian militia units, Wagner group, the Wagner
Yeah, yeah,
group.
yeah, yeah.
It was very messy. It was not just a pure civil war. No.
Okay, gotcha. And so when you were living there, um, did you come across people that would people talk about this going on? What were people?
The,
What was like general like feelings among people? Like were they like we want Ukrainian independence? Like did you come across people that were like pro one side or the other? What did your host family think? Kind of talk to me about that a
Good
little bit.
question. Yeah. Um, yeah, you didn't really run into anybody that was like, um, I want to be part of Russia. I feel more Russian. That was there was definitely, if anyone did feel that way, there was definitely a hush hush part about it, but it was exceedingly few people, and all those people were really like in the occupied territories. Like I would contend it was still much less than 50% of the population there, but those people were in the occupied territories, whatever percent they were. Um, the rest of the country very much wanted their land back and their people back. Two major cities were in the east in the occupied areas, and then of course Crimea was has major cities and was a popular vacation destination for Ukrainians. And people had families on both sides of these lines, right? Like plenty of people had families living in the two regions in the east and Crimea. Um, I would say though, even then in 2018, so the war, that part of the war had been going on for over 4 years since I went when I showed up. Um, just anecdotal, right? Like just thinking of my first host family, learning about this, right? Like I knew about it prior to going, but it doesn't really make the news here, and it's like a everyday news item there, right? Especially if there was any active fighting that day or that week or whatever.
Which is sorry, not to interrupt, but which is so interesting because it's like it wasn't making the news over here, but it's like now the conflict, the war in Ukraine is like that's like top world news over
Yeah,
here.
but even today, I mean, obviously, given our election, given some things that have happened since the election, it's making the news again. But even in these 2.5 years or so that it's been going on full bore, it still falls out of the news sometimes. Like it.
Well, yeah, sometimes, but the initial invasion was
Oh
like
yeah.
that was top news. Like I mean,
Well,
I of
because
course
this is a much. I mean, still a
like
big deal.
how does
It's
this
still a big deal, but the 2014 to 2022 part of it was a much smaller thing than the
okay.
2022 part of it. Much.
So you're saying in 20 the second invasion was it 2021?
2022, February 24th, 2022.
February. So in 2022, that second invasion there, you're saying that's a much bigger issue because like Russia fully, like the country, their military fully got involved, and it was less like kind of maybe like pro-Russia militants inside the country, like creating a bunch of havoc.
Um,
Are you saying like the country directly got involved? Is that why it
it
was
was
a
just
bigger
a much
story?
bigger scale. I would maybe
Okay.
contend with again with the like it was Ukrainians doing it. I mean, these people were like, if there were Ukrainians doing it, a vast majority of them were just like straight up paid, like, hey, raise hell, right?
Hmm.
Um, but setting that aside, just the scale, right? Like especially if you remember the first days, week, month and change, they were going for Kyiv. Like they were going for the capital city. And who knows what exactly they plan to do, but we can all guess, which is that they wanted to overthrow the government and install whoever they wanted to install. The likely answer is this guy named Medvedchuk, who was basically a Ukrainian oligarch, Putin's puppet, basically, who had been involved in Ukrainian business and politics for a long time. And Yeah, so I mean, it was just the scale was totally. I mean, just for some like personal story for that first month and change that they were going for Kyiv, my training town is only an hour and change away from Kyiv. Thankfully, in the right direction, the western direction. If it had been the eastern direction, my host family's town probably would have been occupied, like 100% for that first month and change, not for these 2.5 years, because they kicked them out after like the end of March, early April of 2022. But they would have been occupied. Like Russian soldiers would have been in their building at best. That doing whatever
Yeah.
they do, which is
I mean,
is documented. But they were not hiding. They were away from the windows because of all the shit flying around, especially in that first month or whatever on a daily, hourly basis, so that they didn't get like glass shards thrown at them. So my host family's apartment is very small, and they hosted. So it was my host mom, host dad, and host brother, and they hosted. I don't remember the exact relation, but like a family. I'm pretty sure it was like my host dad's sister, or maybe yeah, I can't remember, something like that, and her husband, who live in
Okay.
Kiev and fled Kiev like day 2 or 3 or something, and were staying with them, and they stayed in the bathroom because there were no windows. So they like one person slept in the tub, one person slept on the floor of the bathroom, and then the rest of them slept in the hallway right outside the bathroom because that was like the next most insulated part from any windows and being in any danger. They did that for like a month and a half. Yeah, and obviously personally, that's what I remember most is texting them and whatever.
And
But
so like obviously right there, like it's safe to say like when you were there and there were conflicts going on, you kind of said wasn't a huge kind of maybe talking point, but like you obviously knew your host family was very much against things going on. Like they didn't like the I don't know, chaos, I guess. I mean,
yeah,
obviously,
but they
no
they
one
feel
likes chaos,
very.
but they want Ukrainian independence.
Oh, for sure.
They want to
Yeah,
be
that's
separate
table
from Russia
that's
completely.
table stakes. Like my
But you
host.
can't make that argument because I'm sure there's people in Ukraine that are pro-Russian. Like it would.
Yes, 100%. But it's a small like there are people that want California to secede or Texas to secede, but like we
Okay.
don't just go like, okay, California, you do you. Like
Yeah.
yes, but it's a very small minority. I was building this a long time ago, but you know, just telling the stories and the personal connections. Even back in 2018 when I went there, they were tired. They were tired of. Ukraine has a very long history. My host brother's grandma, I think she's close to 90. Um, so she was like first, second grade, something like that, when the Nazis occupied her town in Ukraine, much of Ukraine, and her town in Ukraine. Like
Hmm.
she remembers going to school with like German soldiers and whatever going on. Um, they are in a spot that has been fought over for at least 100 years, but really more. But like in our modern idea of history, like at least 100 years, and they have been screwed time and time and time again. Um, they've been fighting for independence again in this modern instance since before World War One,
Hmm.
and then part of Ukraine used to be Poland, like whatever the conception of Poland was then. It might have been an empire, but I don't even really know. Um, and then, of course, they were part of the Russian Empire. Prior to that, come World War II, they become part of the Soviet Union, or prior to World War II, like the 1930s, I think they become part of the Soviet Union. Much of it is occupied by Nazi Germany. The word Ukraine in Ukrainian and Russian, it's Ukraina, and it literally means like we would say the borderland is what we would say.
Hmm.
It means like in between country is what it means in the country. Um, and so it's just been fought over for surely millennia, I guess, but certainly these last 100 years. And so they get independence in 1991 when the Soviet Union falls, and they got pretty used to that. Like my and continue like a young country trying to get its footing generally, but with like an actor like Russia always trying to destabilize it. And I'll give you an example. Like my host dad, it shows the complicated history of it, but also like he is the most. We need to get these bastards off our land
Hmm.
and show them once and for all that we can stand up for ourselves, and then set up our own country and have this never happen again, so that my kid and their kids and whatever don't have to deal with this bullshit.
Hmm.
Um, but he was an officer in the Soviet army. Like he was a major, like a decently high ranking, spent the full however long, I think it's also, or it was anyway, 20 years there to get his pension, spent more than 20 years, I think. And in between that time, when he was an officer, like during his military career, the Soviet Union fell. And so then he became a Ukrainian officer, right? Like, so this is the complicatedness of it, but goes to show that like their prior allegiance, they were subsumed into the Soviet um, uh, Union, the Soviet Empire, prior to that, they were part of the Russian Empire. But since 1991, they've known being an independent country, flawed, of course, like any independent country.
So, but I want to ask you. So you're right, like kind of you said, right? The Berlin Wall falls, Soviet Union collapses. What, and then but then you made a comment about Russia being just kind of like an actor trying to stir up chaos within the country. Why did Ukraine secede from the Soviet Union? I don't even know if you might even know the answer to this, but like, you know, when the Soviet Union fell, they didn't have to be like, okay, Ukraine, you're an independent country now. If they're trying to stir things up, what's Russia's end goal? Why are they trying to stir things up and invade the country? Like, are they trying to, well, in your opinion, are they trying to re-annex it? What are your thoughts? Like, how did Ukraine declare its independence from the Soviet Union?
Are they
Like
trying to re-annex? Are they trying to re-annex it now, basically?
Sure.
Since the invasion, since 2014.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's all speculation, right? No one can really get into the mind of Putin. So I said a long time ago, like,
But why would Russia want to keep stirring stuff up within the country? Ukraine once was a part of.
Because it's a dictatorship and Putin's in charge of.
Yeah, but Ukraine once was a. Do you see what I'm saying? Ukraine once was a part of Russia and of the Soviet Union, and now they're not. Well, the Soviet Union or Russia didn't have to let them go originally. Like, do you see what I'm saying? Like, where does the
Well, I don't know the exact machinations of what exactly happened, but like even when they were a part of the Soviet Union, they were the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, right? Like the
Okay.
Soviet Union was.
So they already were kind of like an independent nation state, kind of.
A little, like sure, like Moscow was the head of the Soviet Union and Russia was the big boy in the Soviet Union, but there was Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, even the Baltics, right? Like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they were all Soviet Socialist republics. And Ukraine was one of them. And it was the borders of what are the internationally recognized, agreed upon borders of Ukraine today, right? Like including Crimea. That was part of the Ukrainian SSR since I think Khrushchev. Which is, I think Khrushchev did it in 1950s or something. He moved it from Russia to Ukraine. So when they broke away with their territory that they had prior to the Soviet Union falling. It was basically just changing the color on the map. It wasn't moving any lines, it was just changing the color, right?
Okay, so but that makes sense. Like that kind of answered my question. I guess I was looking at it in the sense of like when you talked about the Soviet Union, like I think of that as one like general country where it's like you kind of made the good argument that I'd never.
It's like states basically in the U.S.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
With Moscow being D.C. And so because Russia had the vast majority of the population and certainly 90% of the size, it was the big boy.
Gotcha.
But they're like states with they were. I mean, obviously not. It's a very clunky comparison, but I guess that's what you could kind of to wrap your head around it. Yeah.
Gotcha. And so, like, now looking forward, it's the time of recording this, November 2024. What are your thoughts about the war now in Ukraine? And I guess if your mind, like, where do you see like an ending, or do you see an ending in sight?
It's so hard to make predictions. I remember, you're talking about like my initial thoughts, the days that it happened or whatever. And like I said, I didn't think it was going to happen, but it was still in the back of my head. And for those 3 months lead up, and it wasn't until a week and a half before, I think it was February 12th, I believe it was a Friday. Like I remember it being a Friday, that I was like, oh shit, this is going to happen. Like for the people that might be watching or listening to you, I remember Jake Sullivan gave a news press conference that day at the White House, and whatever he said, like, they had been sounding the alarm bell for months at that point, but like I wasn't really buying it. I kind of thought it was all, I just thought it was unlikely to happen for a variety of reasons. And whatever press conference he gave that day, I'm sure I've never gone back and watched it, but you can go back and watch it, and it just hit different. I was like, oh, this is going to happen. And so it was a week and a half of being terrified that it would, and then it did. That's all to say that once it did, Ukrainians obviously being extremely shocked, terrified, depressed, hopeless, and in some ways hopeful. A sense of national unity, a sense of resolve, a sense of strength. They still, most people I talk to, again, totally anecdotal, because they've been through so much, because they've been in this in between the East and the West area, they have this just really stiff upper lip where they just take anything that comes their way, and the optimism, they just kind of have to tell themselves the optimistic take to be like, it's going to be all right. We're going to get through it. We've gotten through before. It's going to be all right. And so most people I was talking to in the first days and weeks were like, for no reason whatsoever, just telling themselves this to make themselves feel better. Oh, it'll be over in the summer. It'll be over by summer. It'll be over in the summer. And me, I guess, just having that connection to them and Ukraine and whatever, but also like being too in tune with the news and politics and this kind of being a hobby of mine and whatever, knew that probably was not true. Like I was basically looking at the fact that I was there when the war was going on in the previous iteration of it, and just knew that there's no chance. Like I just don't see how anyone gets out of this at this point. Certainly by the summer.
Well, so what do you think? Like, what in your mind? How does this come to an end? What's the scenario that like works? Because it's like, let's call a spade here. I don't think it's likely that Ukraine just flat out wins this war.
No, I
like
don't
it's
think so
impossible.
I don't think I've ever thought that. I don't think.
So, so now it's been dragged on for years. Where's the end? What is a fair compromise in your mind for this?
Well, it all. This is why it's it's so unfortunate sometimes. Fortunate, I think, more often than unfortunate, but unfortunate sometimes, especially for Ukrainians, that America is as powerful as it is, because we have elections that not only decide what goes on here, but what goes on other places, and they don't really get a say in that, with certain governments, not just in the U.S., right? Like there's other powerful, certainly Russia, right? Like they don't get a vote in Putin's mind, right? The election presented two very different paths.
Okay, so but
one of those paths was chosen, and at this point, like, I don't know what Trump's going to do. I all the way up in the lead up to the election was telling myself, frankly, that he's just going to roll the over, because that's what he does, at least when it comes to Putin. Just my opinion, right? But
I understand what you're saying, but like there are two paths. But
do you remember who Dan Coates is? No. I think he's a senator from Indiana. But anyway, he maybe I just made that up. But he was, I think, the first director of national intelligence for Trump, his first term.
Okay.
Was there for like a year or something. And he said recently, I don't know if it was before or after the election, but he said something about, like, he doesn't get Trump's relationship with Putin. He doesn't get, like, he truly, like, there's a level of admiration. I want to be like him, but he's like, he used the word blackmail. He's like, perhaps jokingly, but that's not really a joke, right? That's not really funny. He's like, I don't get it, and the only possible, like, it's possibly blackmail. Like, I'm paraphrasing. Go look up the quote. And so but since then there have been signals that, and us being connected to American politics and knowing kind of a lot about the mind of Trump, certainly about the mind of Trump more than maybe even Putin or other big public figures, like, I don't think he wants to be seen as the person that just rolled over. Like,
of course not. And I mean, but here's my thing though.
But the X factor is that it's Putin. It's not Angela Merkel, who he fucking hates her guts. It's not, it's not a random person he's never heard of that he doesn't care about because it's some faraway it's Putin. Like it's the one that since the beginning we've gone like, why does he do the stuff he does with, like, where we're sitting here and the former director of national intelligence is throwing out the word blackmail as a joke or not.
Okay, but Corey, stay on top. How do you see, with or without the president of the United States?
The answer is I don't know, but it's going to come down to Trump.
But here's what I'm saying. It's like with or without Trump. Like, okay, so there's no Trump. What? It's just we stay the course. We keep funding this, and it goes on for another 5 years.
I have no idea.
Or Trump comes in, and then it's like there's maybe some sort of deal that gets worked out faster. I mean, like,
Kamala never talked about it except in relation to Trump. He would roll over for Putin.
Okay.
But she never. I mean, I think it's a mistake to think she would just follow what Biden has done for the last 2.5 years, because circumstances have changed. It's been 2.5 years, right? Like,
but there's only so many options, right? It's like get down to the negotiating table and end this.
Well, that'll happen eventually.
Keep funding it, and then eventually. Yeah, but you can do it sooner than later. That's it.
Right.
Well, because you want to know why we can do it sooner than later? Well, no, that's not. It's absolutely can happen, because you want to know why it can happen sooner than later? Because we're funding this. The minute U.S. support.
Of course, that's what I mean. It comes down to Trump.
No, but it would come down to any president.
Yes, 100%.
So, but that's what I'm saying. So then what?
I'm not saying Trump specifically, although in this case it is. But I'm saying he's going to be the president. It comes down to the president.
But then we could what? Keep funding it, keep it going, or.
But so just to give you an idea, and maybe you're aware of this. I know you're maybe the most online person I know. So. The vast majority of Ukrainians, at least online, have been very, very, very frustrated with Biden and the U.S. basically this entire time.
Why?
Because we have put limitations on them that they have then just rolled, like they have then lifted, right? But it's taken so long, right? So like think about all the talking points throughout that seemed to be red lines for Putin, or he would hint that they were, or whatever. Offensive weapons, that blurry distinction between defensive and offensive weapons. What else? Like intel on striking Russian territory, occupied territory. F-16s, Patriot missiles, and now the long-range missiles, and other things. And at every point, they've kind of gotten up to the, and it may be a strategy, right? Like I think it's been a strategy of Biden and Jake Sullivan and Lloyd Austin and Antony Blinken to basically come to this decision point where it's like, do we cross one of these supposed red lines of Putin, or do we not? And they basically just like slow walk it so that it takes a long time, and once it eventually happens, it's not really that big of an escalation. It's not really an escalation at all, and Putin doesn't even really respond to it in any way. So that could, if they just gave the whole mother load at the beginning, who knows what today is? Maybe it's over, right? Maybe they win. Maybe they kick all the troops out. The Russians.
That was never.
Or maybe we're in World War III. Like you don't know if they had gone harder and faster, what would have happened.
Okay, but here's what I'm saying is like, well, like I said, regardless of president, right? It's like come to the table, negotiate a ceasefire, keep funding it. We'll see where it goes. Could go out years. Or 3, keep funding it, and then eventually Ukraine loses. They don't have the population, they don't have the manpower, they don't have the weapons unless we give it. So like, but where does it end?
It's about trying to put them in as good as a position as possible, because this is like, despite the very online people, the bots, a vast majority of which are probably a vast number of which are probably Russian bots, and despite Trump, when he's on the debate stage and he's asked like, okay, yes, Mr. President, like we understand that you want it to end, but like if let's pretend this is a sports game and you're watching two teams, who would you want to win? He's saying I don't really care. I just want it to end. I just want the game to be over.
Now,
Like you're like, whoa.
well, this isn't going to be a defense of Trump on this point, but from Trump's standpoint, he says, "I just want people to stop dying." I mean, I don't know, call me crazy, but that's not such a crazy thing to say.
And somehow he always starts that conversation with the Russians are dying and the Ukrainians too. Like the Ukrainians are an afterthought for him.
Oh
Like
my. Okay. All I hear is I want people to stop dying, and all I hear is I want us to stop funding wars abroad. But hang on, we're getting off topic because then that could lead me into the next thing. Do you think that the U.S. holds any blame or should take any fault for the invasion, for this war?
no.
So you don't think that the argument that of NATO expansion?
I know the argument.
But what I'm
that's
saying,
why
but
that's why I paused. I considered the argument again. I reconsidered it.
But you think that that's just an invalid. You think that the war was started because Putin's like an irrational actor and is just a madman. That's your theory.
Well, so to get back into my mind where I didn't think it would happen is I did ascribe more rationality to him than I think he has shown since, right? Like I was like, he's not an idiot, right? He's not. He knows this wouldn't go well. Like Ukrainians are not just going to roll over and we're Russia again, we're the Soviet Union again. Like, okay, fine. That is the sort of perspective I bring just from having been there. Is I know that they want to be their own country. They want to join the EU. They want to join NATO. Yes, whatever percent doesn't want that, but like, welcome to any country. No one has every same opinion, right? So I knew it wasn't going to go well. So I'm like, there's no way. Like, he's not that stupid. He's not that disconnected. Like, he knows he can't be that out of touch that he thinks that like Ukrainians are like, yeah, like the motherland, man. Like, bring it on. Let's go. And yet somehow he ended up being that, whether it's because he's in his bubble or people only tell him what he wants to hear, or he truly believes it for whatever other reason, or he doesn't, and he has his other motivations. But what was the question you asked?
Like, what was the reason for this?
Oh, you asked
you think your theory for it starting is just that Putin is a crazy person and wanted to.
I don't know that's my theory.
Okay, so what is your theory? I'm asking you. You lived there. You've talked to people there. You have friends there. What's the thought? You've been into Eastern Europe. What is your thought of what? I don't think
I've ever put together a coherent theory because I'm not sure it matters. But I'll go ahead and try to play one out here a little bit, which is just that. Putin doesn't care about anything but power, right? He doesn't even really so much care about money. I think money is a means to the end of power, and also like a nice side benefit. I mean, the man, obviously gets whatever he wants whenever he wants. He's not working on a government salary, right? Mm-hmm. A Russian government salary. And that he, I believe, truly believes he was like ordained by God to make Russia great again in a certain, a funny phrase. And part of that is, I mean, he's always had this obsession with Ukraine, particularly because it was like, when it was the Soviet Union, it was I don't know about population wise, but it was like the second most important Soviet Socialist Republic of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Like, it was Russia and then it was Ukraine, right? So like, yes, he might want Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia back in a perfect world, but like, that's not the one he's eyeing up, right? And I think it's not even so much that he wants that land. It's not even so much that he wants to kill people. It's that he doesn't care. Like, it doesn't hurt him in any way that he's sending a whole generation of Russian men, certainly some of whom believe in the cause, maybe even a majority of whom believe in the cause, and whether that's because they're brainwashed or because they actually believe it, who knows? But like a good number of whom believe in the cause, but like certainly a number of whom also just got ordered there, right? Like in any war in history. And so that doesn't bother him, right? Doesn't bother him that the economy's tanking. Doesn't bother him that whatever number of things. And so he just, I really believe he truly has like a spiritual thing where he thinks He's playing chess on behalf of making Russia great again because he was sent by God to do that. And
Okay, so you think this is like a personal thing for him? You think that this is Putin?
well, he also just likes to frown, right? Because when you're a dictator, you get bored. Like you don't have to deal with checks and balances. You don't have to deal with passing legislation. You don't have to deal with improving the welfare of the citizens. You don't have to deal with if inflation goes like it did here in the West, or like it does there in the U.S. and the West, like it does there in Russia. You don't have to deal with like the backlash, right? Like public opinion means nothing to you. Like Xi Jinping does not care what the average citizen of China thinks. He cares about what he thinks is going to make the country. I mean, maybe he does care about what the average citizen thinks, but he doesn't have to, right? And Putin doesn't have to. That much should be obvious for a dictatorship generally, but him specifically, obviously.
Okay, so but like for the NATO argument, right? Because how the argument goes is, Ukraine wanted to become a member of NATO, which obviously, Russia kind of drew a red line at. It was like, no, it's a security threat to us, kind of that type of stuff. I want to read you a couple of things, and I just want to get your take on it. So
Okay.
so like George Kennan, the architect of the containment policy, expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American foreign policy in the post-Cold War era. And then
Who's
you
this?
have
Like a Secretary of State?
George Kennan. Yeah, he was the architect of the containment policy, worked in foreign policy post World War II in the United States.
For Vietnam era containment stuff.
Right, but it was like very post World War II, like it was Soviet Union.
Okay.
And then you obviously like the famous one of former Secretary of State James Baker when apparently the Soviet Union
It's a
fell.
little. It's not quite how
It's
it's portrayed, though.
a gray area, but at the same time he said that we gave assurances that we would not move NATO 1 inch to the east, and then since then we've had
But here's the
annexed
thing: is like those countries that have joined since they've chosen to join. They're democratic countries that.
Right. But if you're going to make the argument that the United States is the world's policeman and we're supposed to maintain order in the world, then maybe it should be our responsibility to halt on things that could cause conflict. So, for example, I mean, like flip the situation on us.
But you don't know. But you don't have the counterfactual to say like it might have prevented more conflict than it caused. Like let's say Poland.
You're right, I don't. But I mean, off the basis of if that theory is true of Russia invaded Ukraine because they don't want Ukraine to join NATO, then that's on us for trying to push them into the alliance, right? So like, but
I don't know, but I don't agree with we're pushing them in. I don't agree with that because the vast
okay, you don't have
majority
to.
would want to join.
Okay, that's fine. You don't
Even
have
prior
to.
to 2014.
But that's what I'm saying. You don't have to agree with that. But even if Ukraine wants to join, as us, it's the world's policeman, right? We're supposed to maintain global order. We should say no. If that's going to cause a war, it's off the table. That's just what I'm saying. Also, too,
I don't necessarily have a problem with your in a vacuum what you just said. But again, you don't have the counterfactual to say like, let's say NATO didn't expand to Poland. I'll just give you a funny example is that, and it's actually not connected to me really. It's my cousin worked with a Russian in the past, like for his company who lives here in America and is immigrated and everything. But they just got talking like socially one time, and my cousin was like, "Yeah, my family's quite Polish. We share the mom's side of my family, but not my dad's, and my dad's side of the family is not Polish at all, and even his mom's side of the family." Both sides of his family are Polish, not both of mine, right? And so he's even more Polish than me. And so like he was like, yeah, my roots are like I'm really quite Polish. And she basically asked in the context of like where's your family from? Where's your ancestry from? Do you have any Russian in you? And he was like, no, I don't think so. Vast majority of my ancestry is Polish. And her response, like 100% seriously, was like, same thing. Like that's just kind of the mindset that. I'm not going to ascribe it to every single Russian, of course, but like they have that like Eastern Europe is just kind of part of their world. Maybe even the Balkans, certainly the Baltics. Like if you're Slavic, right, you're a Russian. That's basically Slavic equals Russian, Russian equals Slavic. And so Poland, no one disputes that Poland was never part of the Soviet Union, right? Like it was a satellite state, but it was never part of the Soviet Union even. No one disputes that they're an independent country. This isn't fought over, right? if, let's say, Putin had said, because Russia borders Poland, there's a tiny little part of, like, they could have invaded, they didn't have to invade Ukraine first to get to Poland, they could just invade Poland. Like, you don't know that maybe Poland's been a member of NATO since, I think, the early 2000s, if not the 90s, but I think the early 2000s. In a world where they're
It
not
was
a
the
member,
late 90s. It was 99.
we stick to this promise. There really wasn't a promise, but okay, let's accept that for the sake of the argument that it's a promise. You don't have the counterfactual. I totally get what you're saying in a vacuum, but it's hard to apply that.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is like these counter arguments, right? Because like, okay, so for example, then too,
But
like
it's also a little bit like I'm a little more receptive. Again, I don't concede really at all that it's any of the U.S.'s fault, but I'm a little more receptive to that than I would be to saying it's Ukraine's fault, because again, they just want to choose for their country, for the vast majority of the people there who think should be independent. The vast majority also believe they should be part of the EU, they should be part of NATO. They want to be part of the West as opposed to Russia.
I get that, and I'm not against that. I'm not
Of
against
course.
anything.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying, I'm talking about like the start of the war, where it's ending, and kind of that idea. But like, then can you see like a scenario where like, let's say China had created a military alliance with Canada, right? Like a NATO type for China and Canada. Then China starts. Yes, it is though.
No, it's not, because the U.S. is not China. China's not the U.S. Sorry, they're not.
Okay, but do you see do you see where we would be in that position? Be like, are you kidding me? No, if China starts putting military bases and weapons into Canada that borders the United States, how would we react to that?
Did Canada choose that, or did China just go, you're going to do this now?
Just for the sake of the hypothetical scenario, how would we react to that?
Hypothetical, though.
No, but how would we react to that, regardless of how it happened?
I have no idea, but we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. That should answer your question.
Right. Yeah, and that almost led to nuclear war.
So I get what you're saying. I'm there. I get it. But China's not the U.S. I know we do bad, stupid shit, but like and no need to like.
But do you see, like, for national security reasons, when Russia uses that, I can say, okay, I can see why NATO expansion might be something that they aren't comfortable with.
Right,
like,
but then they point to, like, two little things where it's like, whatever quotes you just read, but really the one they point to is, I think it was James Baker, right?
Yeah, it was James Baker.
Right, they point to that. That wasn't even really, I don't know the exact backstory about it. I should have looked into it because I had a feeling you'd bring it up. But
well, yeah, of course I'm going to bring it up. But also, too, like, that's another thing. It's like, do you know why NATO was created? Was to protect countries from the Soviet Union. Well, newsflash, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore.
But it was like, no, hold on.
So why are we trying to expand
in the form
NATO?
of Russia? It's basically the same.
Now, how so?
They invaded Ukraine. The Soviet Union.
No, Russia invaded Ukraine.
That's what I mean. They invaded Ukraine, right? Like,
so how does the Soviet Union does not exist?
But my point is, like, they're doing shit like invading Ukraine. Whether you want to assign some blame to the U.S. or some blame to NATO or whoever, they did the thing, like, right? Like any other blaming is I hate this phrase, but like blaming the victim, right? Like it's a little like you're missing the forest for the trees. Like, yes, there might be a tree in the forest that's like, this shouldn't have been done on the U.S. side or the NATO side, but like the forest is Russia invaded Ukraine. And that's the base where like everyone should have to operate from. If anyone else operates from some other base, I don't take them seriously. Like, and I know that's not. But
no, but you see what I'm saying though? It's like you're like, okay, the base, Russia invades Ukraine. Yes, that happened. That's the scenario. But it's like, well, why? Like, can you see a scenario? I mean, can you see a scenario where the United States invades another country?
They did not feel threatened. This is my point. Like,
so but okay, that's fine. So you feel like you don't think that Russia was at all threatened with NATO membership by Ukraine?
Putin is one of the most paranoid people on planet Earth. I don't know if you know this, but when he goes to foreign countries, he has a team or whatever that collects his excrement to make sure that wherever he is doesn't get his DNA. People think that's because he might be sick with XYZ or whatever, and they don't want to get insight into that. But also, like, it's just kind of like a paranoid thing to do, right? So even granting that he's one of the most paranoid people on Earth, and he might not be able to see clearly when it comes to whether something might happen or not because he's just wrapped up in his paranoia. I don't grant that. Like I don't. Ukraine joins NATO. They join the EU. I don't. He just wants to. He just wants to have his hands in shit. Right? Like he
Okay,
just wants.
but I get what you're saying. So like say uh, they come to a negotiating table and a little piece of land and no NATO membership for Ukraine is the ceasefire offer.
Okay, what's a
And
little
say,
piece of land? What's a little piece of land? Because it's 20% right now.
but okay, so don't talk about land because that's going to be part of it. But if no NATO membership is part of the deal, and Ukraine and it ends up Ukraine ended up accepting it, there's a ceasefire.
I find that hard. I find that hard that would be that Ukraine would swallow that. But okay, let's for the sake
Okay,
of argument.
so then would any part of you be regretful of how long this dragged out if that's the end? I mean, you have to. I mean, Ukraine's losing an entire generation of young men.
You have to be regretful of lost lives, of course. Like there's full stop. Like but there is a. I shouldn't even put a button there. Like full stop. Period. Of course. End. Like the thing to remember is this wouldn't have happened. You can say it wouldn't have happened if NATO didn't expand. Like people make that argument. Maybe you would make that argument, or you're just playing the devil's advocate a little bit. But
Well, I
like
want to hear what you have to say about that argument.
this doesn't happen if Putin doesn't go. You go. Like he doesn't. He doesn't order his generals and Ministry of Defense and whatever to invade Ukraine, a place that's on the other side of a line that all countries except for now like Russia and Belarus and North Korea agree on. Then this doesn't happen. Period. So, am I regretful that Putin invaded Ukraine? Of course. Then you talk. Then you go to the next step, which is like, okay, it's been 2.5 years, and it'll be however much longer until perhaps something gets frozen or settled or whatever you want to call it. Um, Again, I just don't know what the alternative is because, especially in the very beginning, which is the last time that peace talks have taken place, Ukraine was in an even worse position, right? Like they were any day. I was literally waking up. I was living in Seattle at the time, so the time difference was even greater. It was 10 hours instead of 7, and so I was waking up and or was it? No, I was going to sleep and I was checking that like on the live webcams. I was following, every news feed. I was, scrolling Twitter like it was my job, right? I was checking to make sure like Kyiv hadn't fallen yet. As long as Kyiv hadn't fallen, there might be a chance to somehow push them out, to somehow quiet things down, to basically move into the next days, months, years, whatever, without whatever having happened if Kyiv had fallen. And so I don't know when that point would have been in this, basically is what I'm saying. And that's any conflict. It's like, where do you see the off ramp, right? Like, no, but that's what I said. I don't know why these people that I was hearing from anecdotally were saying the summer, because I was like, what do you see as the way out for anyone here? And so I don't know where the point would have been along the 2.5 years and change, or it'll be 3 years soon or whatever, where it would have been like, this is the way out. Because as long
So,
as
like, where do you see
long as
that
Putin is
where do you
like,
see that now?
as
Like,
long as
where?
Putin is like, this here, I've already got that, that's mine. You guys, my soldiers, keep fighting for the rest of whatever. Where's the way out?
You tell me. What do you think that point is? If you
Well,
had to
very
guess.
practically, this is not what I'm saying it should be, but very practically is like if just guessing here, the more I try to be hopeful and optimistic, given that the election didn't go the way that I would have wanted to go, at least for Ukraine, and generally, but I think you know that, but for Ukraine, I've been trying to think through things since the election, right? Like we all knew it was 50-50 election. Who knows who was going to win? So I was like, but you can't possibly like wrap your head around what are going to be the consequences either way once it does happen, and then it happens, and then you figure out what the consequences are. And so I've been trying to wrap my head around it, and the more I read, I'm trying to convince myself of optimism. Like Trump doesn't want to be the one that rolls over, as I mentioned, but I think ultimately what he's going to do is he's going to do the same thing he did in 2019 to Zelensky, although for a totally different reason. I grant that. And the 2019 reason was if he has genuine motivations about just wanting to end bloodshed and restore stability and peace, then the 2019 reason for shaking down Ukraine is worse than that reason would be, if that is his reason. I think he's going to go, look, you at least need to start talking. If you don't start talking, like here's the thing is like Putin has never, this is what I go back to, like Putin has never shown an interest in talking, at least since the beginning.
Well, hang on. So let me
question his motivations.
Well, I can counter that. I mean, do you know the story of Boris Johnson meeting with Zelensky? What do you don't think? Do you think there's any credibility to that?
I don't believe that. No.
You don't think that happened at all? Because I mean, that's certainly that's an argument. It's just Boris Johnson met with Zelensky, and Zelensky had kind of stated that they were looking
sources on that. I think it's as
well.
Likely,
so wait. So let me tell.
It's as likely it's a piece of Russian propaganda. Seriously, like I'm not someone that goes, that's Russian propaganda. I think it's about as likely as it's a piece of Russian propaganda as it is that it actually happened. But
okay, but for the sake of the show, let me explain. So essentially, like, long story short, Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister of England at the time, and he met with Zelensky at the very start of the war. I think they might have been 2 or 3 months in.
It was just after like they had pushed forces back from Kyiv. It was probably early April, I would guess. So a month and a half, maybe.
Right, and so
he was the first foreign head of state to go visit.
And so Zelensky had kind of said that there was maybe a possibility to end the war sooner than later, and Boris Johnson essentially nixed the peace deal on the behalf of the United States, England, and the rest of the West, and said that Putin, the West wasn't done fighting, and that Putin couldn't be negotiated with. But hang on, this goes back because a direct quote from Lloyd Austin.
I agree with Putin couldn't be negotiated with. But go ahead. Are you going to talk about the quote from Lloyd Austin when he was standing in the hangar in Zhezhov airport after visiting Ukraine and said, we need to degrade Russia's military or something? Is that the quote?
Right. So we need to exhaust the Russian military so they can't fight anywhere else in the world.
Would that be a bad thing to do? Seriously.
Well, I mean, that's not a good moral standing for the United States to be funding this war.
It's not a good. I don't think it's a good moral standing. I don't think it's a good moral standing at the cost of lives, but just like in the abstract, degrading Russia's military, I'm on board.
But that's not our job. It's not our job to spend $100+ billion to exhaust the Russians.
That's a pretty good investment.
Look, if we are out there,
we spend how much a year on the military, and we're only spending $100 billion to basically cut Russia's military.
Right, but Corey, listen. If we're helping a country that was wrongfully invaded try to fight for their independence, it's a different story than us purposely prolonging a war to exhaust another country.
Granted, absolutely. But both things can be true, right? And so I don't.
So you wait, back up. You don't think that story of Boris Johnson and Zelensky is credible at all, and you don't believe that for a second. You don't think the war could have been ended any sooner than it.
If it did it, so yeah, I'd also like to go back. I said it was about. I think it's probably as likely it was Russian propaganda. As it actually happened. I think it's much more likely that it's Russian propaganda. I also think that if it did happen, it's just part of the propaganda is that like it's been completely twisted. I don't think Zelensky was like, hey, we've got this proposed deal, and Johnson was like, we're not done, and so you're not done. I don't think it was like that. I mean, everything is more nuanced than portrayed in the media probably, but I think it was more, if it did happen, and I don't think it did, but if it did happen, I think it was more like, hey, have you considered that in the future it'll make it less likely that Russia ever tries to do this again if, you actually kick them out. And again,
And that might be
again,
we could speculate about it all day.
and we can
What I'm
speculate,
trying.
and we can speculate that anyone ever thought it was really possible that they would kick them out. We've already talked about that. But yeah.
Okay. All right.
But to go back to the just to reiterate the Lloyd Austin thing, I know exactly what you're talking about. He was standing in. I've been to this airport when I visited Ukraine, and there's Patriot missile batteries everywhere at this airport. It's a civilian airport, but with a military component. He was in some hangar, standing next to Anthony Blinken, and he said this quote that. So I'm intimately familiar with this quote, and like I would say, like I don't think that points to any nefarious reasons. To any nefarious conversations with like Boris Johnson or messages from the U.S. to Boris Johnson to relay to Zelensky or anything. I don't. But again, the whole like we've spent $100 billion or we've spent whatever number gets thrown out there. My argument would be that's a damn good investment. Just my argument.
Okay. And so look,
not again, not at the expense of human lives, but in the abstract, if you're just talking about that reason alone or that end alone, then I believe that, yes.
Okay. And so last question, and then I want to move on, and we'll talk about your.
I don't think I ever answered the question of how I think it ends, though. But
yeah, well, that's what I want to say. I say when Trump gets inaugurated in January, do you think it will be over in 6 to 9 months?
No.
Okay.
And of course, in typical Trump fashion, he's been saying since he started running for president again, which is whenever it was, right after the midterms, 24 hours, right? Like the man's a con artist. That's what he does. But I do believe it'll be on his list, high on his list of priorities. I do think there'll be his domestic priorities, which will be his main priorities. But as far as foreign priorities, I think he's going to give a blank check to Israel.
Well, we're not. Ukraine.
Well, I think there's only going to be really two things he's thinking about foreign, is what I'm going to say. And I think on the wars the wars in the Middle East, Israel, whatever you want to call them. Mm-hmm. I think he's going to give a blank check even more than it. I'm sure there are plenty of people, certainly Democrats, that think Biden has given Israel a blank check. I think you're going to see the true definition of a blank check, and I think that's going to solve that for him. He doesn't really care about the details of that one for whatever reason, whether it's because he has an affinity for Putin or whatever. I think he's going to be more involved in this one than the other one, and just a feeling, and that's upsetting. Before we get off this, I just want to bring, I think, a little bit of just the perspective that I bring, given that I'm connected to it, is like I mentioned that Ukrainians have been screwed over and over for 100 years. I fear that is in the offing again, and it's disappointing. It's upsetting. It's angry. It's infuriating. Certainly for me, so I can only imagine how it is for them. They're people. They just want to live their lives. They just want to be an independent, free country. They think they've earned that right, but more than earned that right. I think they would say that, and I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that they're not going to be screwed again. I hope that, and going back to, I said about my host mom in 2018, from the start in 2014, and my host family, they were tired. They're sick of this. Like,
right.
There's no one more tired and sick of this. Like, I don't care how many tax dollars we ever have to pay to send weapons there. There's no one going to be more tired and sick of this than they are. Right.
I understand that, and that's my argument. It's like I don't feel like we are not exhausting every avenue to end this for the Ukrainian people in a way that is good for everybody involved. You just talked about how exhausted they are. It's like, well, what happens when they get so exhausted that they're just like throw their hands up?
But then the question comes, what comes next? Which is they lost 20% of the country. Yeah. That's not great alone, right there, done, not great, right? Like there's people, they have families in that 20%, they have friends in that 20%. Also, just like imagine California's not even close to 20% of our territory. Imagine we just lost California. Like and the rest of the world was like, suck it up, live another day, like move on with your life, right? Like you use the example of like China and Canada, like to bring it back to examples that we might know more better, might be more familiar to us. I think that's a decent example where it's just like, get over it. Like, well, you can't really get over it. You can maybe try to move on, of course, but if that's what ends up happening, not easy to get over. And then, of course, there's the whole aspect of deterrence. And I know you're not thinking about that. I know other people aren't thinking about that, but there are plenty of people that aren't thinking about that. They don't care. They're just like, end it. And I worry that Trump might be that, right? Like he might be like, I'm gone in 3 years anyway. I just want to win. Just get it over with. I don't care what comes next. And so you're talking about like, we need to do what we think will keep the peace, right? We need to avoid war at all costs if we are to be any sort of policeman or whatever. Agreed. We agree on that. 100%, full stop. I think we just disagree on how to get there, perhaps. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's. That was a good discussion. Let's move on a little bit. I want to talk to you about your experience and in the military.
Okay.
Like I mentioned, civil affairs soldier.
I had a feeling it was going to be that and Ukraine. I didn't expect the Peace Corps stuff. I figured, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because that ties into the entire story, is right. Like you lived in Ukraine, like you kind of saw firsthand how the people were.
It's part of it's. I'm not gonna say it's mostly the reason. I don't know if I can assign percentages to it, but it's certainly part of the reason I joined. Yeah. I mean,
The Peace Corps.
Join the Army.
Okay, the Army. Okay, so I know this is relatively new. You kind of just finished basic training. How did you decide to do that? And tell me about what basic training was like. And I guess why did you decide to join the Army Reserves instead of a different branch of the military, maybe?
Yeah. Thanks for giving me a break to calm down. So I actually first went to a recruiter's office in 2017 when I left law school, just trying to figure out what to do. And it was an Air Force recruiter. Took some practice tests for the military entrance exam. It's called the ASVAB. And kind of was like, yeah, that's interesting. Like I was interested in it, but Peace Corps was my first choice. I felt like Peace Corps was a now or never thing, and then if I wanted to ever join the military later, I could do that when I got back, sort of thing. And so put that on hold. This all kind of connects, obviously, right? Like it's a timeline that intertwines. I was in Ukraine December of 2019, I think it was, starting to think about I was going to be leaving October 2020. Of course, I ended up leaving early in March 2020, but was going to be leaving in October and starting to think about what I was going to do after, whether I was going to extend my time there in the Peace Corps. You can extend, I think, 1 year at a time, up to 5 years, so you can extend like 3 times. I was thinking about that, recontacted this Air Force recruiter and said like, hey, I'm going to be returning next year. And he was like, well, it's a little early, we'll be in touch, whatever. Got sent home early and found myself basically perhaps looking to go back to law school, but also just kind of buying time through 2020 and 2021, doing Instacart and working at an Apple store. And so then come working at an Apple store 2021, had decided that, I don't know if I decided, but like I was thinking that law school might be less likely. Then all of this stuff starts to hit the news that this might be about to happen. Mm-hmm. And I felt compelled that it felt like another now or never moment. I was getting a little older. Certainly people can join like up to 35, I think. And I had like 35-year-olds in my basic training class. But it felt like another now or never moment for me personally in my timeline and everything. So tried to join the Air Force.
So what was going on with Ukraine was a big motivation for you to join?
100%. It was.
Okay.
It was. Again, I don't know whether it's mostly, but it certainly wasn't all, because I was looking to do it before 2017. But this was like the kick in the butt that was like, it might be stupid to some people. It's the tiniest little piece, but you can do something, right? Mm-hmm. Like you can do your tiny piece. And so actually at the time I was looking to join the Air Force, and I was looking to, again, mention the Air Force, and I was looking to join active, and try to be a linguist. I think the technical position, the term of the position is CLA, I think, cryptologic language analyst, I think.
So like a translator.
Pretty much, your job is basically to listen, like have headphones and listen and transcribe. And it was a long process, frankly. People that know, I don't know if you ever got let into it, but with Connor, Connor knows, and my family knows, or whatever. So it was when I really started to reach out and be like, okay, this is I think the direction I want to go. Was, I think it would have been January 2022. And then I vividly remember, again, talking about that day. I think it was the 12th of February. I know it was a Friday, that I realized it was going to happen. I emailed my recruiter that day, and I was like, let's do this. Like, I'm ready. Like, what's got to happen? No more dilly-dallying. I've got a lease that's ending in Seattle. I think it was the end of July. I was like, what do we need to do between now, February, and July, so that come the end of July, I can join. I'll quit my job at the Apple Store. That's no problem, and join. And it was mostly medical stuff. Like, it was basically, he was like, well, again, it's still too early if you want to join at the end of July. And I was like, yeah, I don't really want to, I don't think I want to break my lease, although there's like military protections around that, whatever. I was like, let me just finish out this lease, and then I'll join. And that'll have gotten me like 8, 9 months, something, 10 months at the Apple Store, so I don't just like quit after like 5, 6 months or whatever. So that seems right. We'll do that. So then come like July timeframe, as I'm starting to ramp up, I actually, because this recruiter I was working with, I just kept, there's recruiters over, but I kept working with him. He was based in Buffalo, obviously, where I'm from. And I actually flew home twice, I think, from Seattle to go to like medical appointments and stuff at the base in the Falls, where they have the military entrance, they call it MAPS, military entrance processing station, and went through like all the processes there. And then at the time, the Air Force was like super backed up. I don't know if they still are. They probably still are. And it took like 45 business days or something to like evaluate my file. And there were like a few things in my medical history that had to get waived. You have to get waivers. And the Air Force has, I think, certainly higher than the Army, but I think like the highest medical standards of all the branches. And I failed the hearing test according to, at those medical appointments, according to Air Force standards. And then there were 2 things in my medical history that had come up that I needed waivers for. And I didn't get them. They said no thanks. And I was kind of surprised. He seemed to indicate that doesn't really happen that often. They end up giving the waivers. And he basically said, like, don't let this stop you, though. You can join any other branch you want to. You have to wait 6 months to reapply to the Air Force, but you can join any other branch right now. And literally down the hall in the same building was a Navy recruiter, went to talk to him, worked on stuff there for a little while, and ended up reaching out to an Army recruiter. And then that was, this would have been September 2022 that this was kind of going on, September, October 2022. I didn't end up getting the go-ahead to kind of like, okay, you passed the medical stuff, to join until like, I think it was May or June of next year.
Okay, so 2023.
Another like 6 or more months of going through a number of medical appointments, a lot of paperwork, and a lot of back and forth. And then they got me that okay. And then I signed my contract end of July 28th of 2023. And then I shipped to basic training October 3rd, 2023.
And where was your so once you were denied from joining the Air Force, you ended up joining, he went to basic training for the Army Reserve. Where was your basic training, and kind of what did that entail?
Yeah, and that, just to say, like you mentioned, reserve, because in the meantime I had gotten a job that I didn't want to leave.
Right.
And so I went from looking active to looking reserve. And in the Air Force, actually, you get to pick, or you have to pick like 10 jobs and rank your 10 jobs, and they don't guarantee you the first one. It's like needs of the Air Force, right? In the Army, just a thing of history, but also like at the time they were really struggling with recruitment. They're still, of all the branches are struggling, but of all the branches, the Army's struggling the most. Um, they let you pick your job. Like you have to qualify, but they let you pick your job. And so I picked civil affairs, which is unique to the Army and Marines. It's not in any other branch, and it focuses on a number of things. But the best layman's comparisons, the best way I can kind of translate it is that it's like the military's FEMA. Or another kind of funny one is like Peace Corps with guns.
Okay.
So it's like if there's a conflict, if you're in a conflict zone, if there's a war, if you're just deployed somewhere, you're doing something related to like the civilian population, the humanitarian needs, humanitarian aid, trying to enable local governance. Yeah, lots of stuff like that. So anyway, so basic training in South Carolina. Fort Jackson, South Carolina. It's one of 4, I think. Yeah, Army basic training spots. Depends on your job where you get sent. Other things too, but depends on your job in the Army. And civil affairs goes to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And basic training is the same for like everyone, right? So active, National Guard, Reserve. You go through the same 10-week basic training. The only people that have like a separate basic training path is these people that go through what's called OSIT, which is, I don't even know what it stands for, but it's basically basic training plus secondary training together, combined. And that's, I think, just combat MOSs, combat jobs. So your infantry, your whatever, like the real hardcore people, and that sucks. OSIT is like, if I thought basic sucked,
Yeah.
OSIT is like,
Well, what did basic training entail? Like, what were the hardest things you had to overcome?
we could talk a whole day just about that. It's all mental, and not all mental. I shouldn't say that. I went in relatively prepared for the physical aspects, I think. But it's really it very quickly turns into Lord of the Flies. And it's kind of designed that way, right? Like that's kind of on purpose. The yelling is as long as you kind of like care and try and do something. The yelling from like the drill sergeant or whatever, it's not. They don't yell at you specifically so much, right? Like it's more like collective, and so you don't really get called out if you're just trying to do the thing,
right?
Whatever you're doing. And you get over it real quick. Like as soon as you get yelled at once, like the rest of the time, you're just like, I don't care. And everybody's already gotten yelled at multiple times. So, and yeah, I mean, it's these different phases and stuff. One of the big aspects of it is learning how to shoot. Obviously, I had never shot a weapon before. And it's obviously really standardized and really made sure that it's safe. Right, you're shooting live bullets. People like me, other people that have never shot before.
Right.
Although they actually say that like the people that have shot before are the ones that kind of have to worry about because they're the kids that just kind of walk out there and like, I know what I'm doing, right? And they're just too dangerous in whatever way. But it's really like I went in at 28 years old, signed my contract and went in at 28, and it was. And actually, the guy I signed my contract with warned me about this. He's like, "You're older. You're very obviously, like a certain level of maturity. Obviously, comes with that." He goes, "You're also just like, you didn't have to enlist. You could have been an officer. You chose to enlist because civil affairs doesn't let you join. I wanted civil affairs, and you can't join civil affairs as an officer. You can only join at the enlisted and then move up." And he's like, these are going to be a lot of young kids, a lot of straight 17, 18-year-olds, right? Like straight out of high school or whatever. And they just don't have maturity, like whatsoever. Like he goes, I'm sure you were a relatively like mature 17 or 18-year-old, but you're like, you were certainly less mature than you are now.
Okay. So you were talking about the kids being younger and mature coming out of coming out straight out of high school. What was his like kind of what was his end message there? Like, why did he tell you that?
Well, because he was basically just like, be prepared. Like that's the thing. That'll be the hardest part for you. He was guessing.
It's like living with these younger kids.
Just like, yeah, just wanting every day to be shake them and be like, if you just shut up, we'll go to bed earlier and like actually get 6 hours of sleep tonight and whatever, right?
Hmm.
And there's a million. I'd have to think of them. I'd have to write down some funny stories. But there's a million stories. If I can think of any off the top of my head, um, I mean, just the days where the rules are like it's such a fever dream, and then like it's so designed to just with you like it's that it's hard to explain to someone that hasn't been like I said so many times that I wish like people could see this. Like I don't
Hmm.
know how to put this into words without someone seeing just the level of mind fuck that goes on at this thing. But also like I don't actually wish that because it's a level of demeaningness and emasculation that I mean that almost that even an 18-year-old wouldn't really want to endure, but certainly a 28-year-old who feels like he's sort of started to build a life for himself a little bit and is like willingly subjecting himself to like this emasculation on a daily basis where like you have to get in line to go to the cafeteria and you can only eat for 10 they only give you 10 minutes to eat max and
Hmm.
you can't you can't eat anything else anywhere else and then you come back and someone has a granola bar in their pocket because the drill sergeants made everyone shake out their pant pockets and whatever and then people start hiding it in their underwear but they're an idiot. So when they go back up to the barracks and they eat it and they throw out the trash wrapper in the wrapper in the trash, the drill sergeants come through 30 minutes later and they dump out the trash in the middle of the barracks and look for any food wrappers and they were like, well, I was only going to make you clean up the trash that I just dumped out, but now that I found a food wrapper, go back downstairs and you're not going to bed tonight and you're standing outside in the 30-degree weather and in summer uniform, have fun. Like just the level of it's just
That's
but
crazy.
one of those things where it's the mental and emotional roller coaster when you're in it is just it's really hard but you have to take it one day at a time where you're
Hmm.
just getting through that day and I would write letters and I would call with my family and I would say like I am counting not only the days but I count the meals like I'm like just get to the next meal right
Hmm.
like just it's the one thing the army doesn't with you on is like it's a regulation like they have to feed you 3 times a day so like it's like clockwork like if you get to the next meal you made it through whatever piece of that day. And
Well, what were the meals like? And I guess like yeah, I mean, guess the food situation and I mean and like you mentioned, you're there in the reserve, so like once you made it through, how many times you like report back for training or kind of how often are they in touch with you?
well, that's the thing is like once at least me being in reserve, I knew it was active generally is easier. It depends on the job, depends on the unit, all that sort of stuff. But even active duty life is not like basic training or not like training generally. They call it TRADOC. It's not. It's a different animal. And actually, in a lot of ways, my secondary training. So that was from basic training was from October to December, and from January to we had like a 3 week break. I was very lucky. It was a blessing and a curse, honestly, because I came back to a normal life and then I had to go back in, and it was like hard. Like it was really hard to go back into it and be like another 10 weeks. Here we go. Um, and that second training from January to March in so many ways was harder, and I can tell stories about that. But the main one was that we had something called they call it fire guard, which is it's basically just a way to sleep deprive you and make you miserable. And so I got like max like 4.5 hours of sleep every night for like 10 straight weeks, except for Sundays. We got to sleep in on Sundays. So I'd sleep like 10 hours, on a Saturday, Sunday night. And so active duty life is like even easier than that. But like me being in the reserve was just like just get through this, right? Like
Hmm.
just all you got to do. This is your unless and until you ever get deployed. This is your really hard moment.
Hmm.
The rest of the people not in the reserve or the guard, the rest of the people that are active, they don't get to go home, right? Like they have this free week in the break in the middle too, because they're lucky because of the way the calendar fell and the way they got shipped and reported. Um, but like at the end of their secondary training, they just go straight to whatever base they're assigned to, right? Like they live the life then for however many years, and the minimum contract I think is 3, and they're only 6 months in or something, or max like a year in at that point. So they got 2 to 2.5 or more to go.
Hmm.
And so I was just like, just get through this, and that helps you the day by day thing. So the commitment is once you get out of TRADOC training. So for me, it was basic training, and then and that's again same no matter what job except for the combat jobs, and same across reserve and active and guard. You go to your job specific training, right, which is the secondary. They call it AIT, Advanced Individual Training. And so that was specific to my job, civil
Hmm.
affairs. Civil affairs specialist is technically the job name, and also it was reserve specific too. The active, some jobs have advanced AIT, the secondary training. Again, the same mix of reserve and active and guard all together. In my case, civil affairs active and reserve training is separate. They're 2 totally different things for civil affairs. The secondary training. So that was job specific. That was the second 10 weeks. Then once you get out of that, you have to graduate that. And actually that was like graduating basic training is just like, just kind of do what you're told, keep your head down, and somehow don't quit. That's what they tell you. Just don't quit. If you don't quit, they say you don't quit, you don't fight, you don't, like, you'll make it through. And that's generally true. Like there's other ways, but yeah, just don't quit, right? The second part was actually like a little bit like we started with 12, we only finished with 7. 5 people did make it. Like 1, I think, quit, and the other 4 were not kicked out, but were didn't make that training and either had to come back for another round of training later to try again or choose a different job or whatever.
Hmm.
And then so then you graduate that, which was middle of March for me. And then as soon as April, I had my first weekend report, which is like you go to your unit once a month.
Okay, gotcha. That's what I wanted to ask. How many times do you get down there and kind of report back?
Once a month,
And just
there's
for a
units
weekend?
there's units all over for the weekend. Yeah, so it's like 7 a.m. Saturday and 7 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Saturday and Sunday. Sometimes Fridays as well. Like a few weekends in the year, it's Fridays as well. And there's units all over the country for every job, but for civil affairs even. The closest one to me is like it's in White Plains, Maryland, which is like 40 minutes south of me here, here of DC. Yeah, and it depends what you do. Like what you do, sometimes it's training, sometimes it's like paperwork because you're only
Hmm.
showing up once a month, and like so every so often there's paperwork to do, which wouldn't be that often if it was an everyday thing. But like you're like, I just did paperwork a couple drills ago. Why am I doing paperwork again? Because you only show up
Gotcha.
once a month. And beyond that, you have an annual training requirement. So beyond that, 1 weekend a month, you have an annual training requirement that consists of 2 weeks a year. So like it depends on your unit, and you can attach with other units if you want to go to, like, you can go to Germany to train there. You can go to California or Louisiana or different training centers. My unit in May, I'm trying to transfer units, but if I stay with this unit that long, is going to Texas for their annual training. And as a company unit, you train there for 2 weeks, and that fulfills your annual training requirement. So it's 1 week a month and 2 weeks a year. Of course, at any moment, at any time, you could get deployed, and you can also volunteer to deploy. There's plenty of people that join the reserve, and kind of because there's protections around, like you can't fire people for joining the reserve and stuff, or you can't lay them off or whatever. There's plenty of people that like do that, and to hold their job, they have to hold their job for so long, but like also they want to deploy, right?
Mhm.
And pick their deployment. You could volunteer for a deployment to a certain country or on a certain mission or whatever. So, but that's basically extent of it.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, look, like when I heard you were joining the army, I was kind of surprised, just because like obviously I've known you, and I just couldn't imagine what basic training was like. So
I
like
didn't think I'd get
that's the
through
stuff that
myself.
that's the stuff that interests me the most. Is just kind of like getting through that, because like you hear the horror stories, like you hear how difficult it is. Um, but no, that's awesome.
It's a mental difficult though. It's not. I mean, it's for some people more than others. It's a physical difficulty, of course. It's a mental difficulty. For me, that's the other thing about like the 18-year-olds that went through it or whatever. Like it seems like everything rolled right off their back. They're like,
Hmm.
oh, it doesn't bother me that we only got 4 hours of sleep tonight because we were standing out in the cold. Oh, it doesn't bother. And it's like this shit ain't rolling off my back. Like
Yeah.
I'm struggling to get through the day and week here. I don't know how many make it 10 weeks. And you do like mental math too, where or like fake math, where you're like, well, I've been here so like I really am already 40% through because if you consider the last 2 weeks aren't really that important. So like you play games with yourself. Like it's
Yeah.
almost like prison in a lot of ways. Not that I have any way to compare it to that, but
Yeah.
what maybe we would conceive of prison. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Corey, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Of
I
course.
really enjoyed hearing about the Peace Corps, your take on
I'm glad I
Ukraine
could
and
be your
the
guinea
Army.
pig.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it again. Like I think this was
Yeah,
really well. Thank you for coming on, and yeah, we'll have to do it again later down the line. Again, we'll have to talk more about the Army, how that's going. Have to
yeah.
check back in.
I'll have to think of more. I'll have to think of basic training stories for sure, or secondary training stories.
And also, if we do it again, you'll have more experience, more weekend
Sure, yeah. I might
reports to
even transfer
check in about.
units by then, and that'll give me a different perspective on like unit specific stuff, which I've only been with one so far. So yeah. We always have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, we'll do this again. We'll do this again. But again, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds good.